My argument is that actually no, what actually automation might do is allow us the time then to be like the ancient Greeks. I mean, ancient Greece was a slave society, and so, if you were a citizen, then you had slaves doing everything for you. That was the automation, and you just got to live an agonal lifestyle where you concentrated on self-cultivation, on competition, on excellence and striving and achievement. And so my argument is actually, well, imagine a world where actually automation allows people to do that instead. And, so you end up with like agonism on Mars, basically.
So what's a Legionaries? Welcome to another episode of the Warrior Philosopher podcast. I am joined by, of course, a common guest on the show, Lance's Legion, General Lance, but also a very special guest today, Egg Nationalist, who many of you are familiar with for sure, and we're going to be talking about his translation of Publius Cornelius Tacitus's Germania. But before that, Ren, if you just briefly introduce yourself to the Legionaries.
Yeah, sure. No, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you both. I've been looking forward to it greatly. So, who am I? Well, I'm a formerly anonymous Twitter poster writer. I sprang to a certain amount of notoriety in 2020 when I published Egg Nationalism, the cookbook, and I was in the Tucker Carlson documentary, The End of Men, in 2022, which really kind of pushed me into the spotlight. I've written a book called The Eggs Benedict Option in 2022 as well, which is about the plan for a global plant-based diet. I had my identity rather rudely revealed by an activist group in the UK in 2024, almost a year ago now. And so I've been a known commodity ever since. It's been great, actually. It's helped me to take my profile to a new level. I'm writing for The Spectator, for various pretty mainstream publications, making personal appearances, and I've got a new book out. It's actually, I think it's coming out at the end of this month with Passage Press. It's called The Last Men, Liberalism and the Death of Masculinity, and it is about the political implications of testosterone decline.
Awesome. And I watched your video with Russell Walter. He's been on my podcast a few times on the Eggs Benedict option, and I think
he's a good guy. He's a good guy.
Yeah, super cool. The Aussies are badass people. But so today I want to discuss Germania. And before we get into your translation, what inspired you to feel like this needed a retranslation? Because I have read other translations before, and I did enjoy this translation a lot. And so what made you want to come back to this old work?
Well, actually, you know what? I translated the book 10 years. I translated the treatise, whatever you want to call it, 10 years ago, actually. So before I went up to Oxford and did my PhD in medieval history, which I started in 2015 and finished in 2018, I wanted to do something nice for my Latin tutor. So I had a Latin tutor, and because I didn't learn Latin at school. I mean, Latin isn't commonly taught in school anymore. It's not even really commonly taught in public schools, in private schools in the UK anymore. I mean, it used to be an essential part of the education of an educated person, and certainly of a particular class. But that's not the case anymore. So I had a private tutor outside school and outside university to teach me Latin, and I thought it'd be nice to do something for her. So I translated the Germania and wrote a commentary on it, and had a short run I had it published in a short run, gave her a copy of the book and gave it to other people as well. But then when I was an anonymous Twitter poster, when I was writing anonymously, before June of last year, then I tried to avoid talking about actually my interests, because things that I'd studied at university, etc., things that I'd done before I was the Royal Nationalist, because I didn't want to give away too much information about myself that could be used to identify me. So I didn't really talk about the fact that actually I had translated this, Germania by Tacitus, which I mean, I read it. I read it with my tutor. I read Germania with my tutor, and really enjoyed it. And we had a lot to talk about it. And I thought, well, that would make a suitable book. But anyway, once I was doxxed, once my identity was revealed, I thought, well, actually, you know what? I can talk about some other stuff that I've done. And one of the things I had done was to you know do a new translation of Germania and write a commentary on it. And so I thought, you know what, it would be quite cool to publish that. So I did, as you know, because I've been self-publishing stuff on Amazon since 2020. It's very easy to do, potentially quite profitable as well. I mean, the thing about translation, of course, is that I mean, there are a lot of translations of Tacitus Germania already, but they're quite old. I mean, they're like standard translations of it. One of them is by Mattingly, and they're kind of archaic, and it's quite nice to drag it into the 21st century, but also actually, I think to I mean, I thought that a lot of the translations of Tacitus actually don't really capture the defining qualities of his Latin very well, and so I tried to do that. And one of the things I tried to preserve as well, actually, in the translation, is the strangeness of some of it, because it is strange, and it probably would have struck Tacitus's contemporaries as strange. His mode of expression. I mean, it's very, 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 very compressed. It's very, very compressed. Tacitus was writing really in opposition to the great the great writers of the kind of golden age of the late Roman Republic, early Empire. People like Cicero, Caesar, Livy. Although Livy, I suppose, is kind of Silver Age. Tacitus had this style that was basically a rejection of the kind of crystal clarity of the earlier writers, people like Cicero and Caesar. That was, I mean, people have commentators and have said that actually that Tacitus's style is a reflection, basically, of his political philosophy and of his belief that the Roman, well, it was the Roman Empire by that point, that Rome had become corrupted, and that it was that the writer's aesthetics, that the way that a writer wrote, and especially a historian, political historian, um, that a historian actually had to write in a way that was reflective of the fact that actually, like, the political system was decaying, that there wasn't direct access to the truth. So I mean, his style is kind of is very compressed, and it's kind of enigmatic, and it's unbalanced. It doesn't have these sort of flowing classical periods that you would associate particularly with Cicero. Um, and so I tried to capture some of that. I wanted there to be something kind of left over, something that couldn't kind of be assimilated in the translation. So it was just an interesting exercise, really. I mean, I enjoy translation. I think it's an interesting exercise mentally, but also kind of philosophically. And so I was trying to really to write a translation of Tacitus that looked a bit more like the way Tacitus actually wrote, rather than these kind of earlier translations, particularly the one by Mattingly that I mentioned. So I mean, it was, when I did it in 2015, I didn't think that it would be, anything other than a small run of I think I had 20 books published, something like that I just gave to people. With a small publisher. I didn't think that many people would ever read it, but actually now, I mean, it's sold a lot of copies actually on Amazon, which is interesting, and people have been very interested
I
in
can
it.
proudly say I'm an owner of one of those copies, by the way, and it's part of the reason why we were so frankly galvanized to have you on the show to talk about it, because my personal experience has been the same regarding Germania. I mean, my first, kind of, I guess, intellectual exposure to it was back in high school. And of course, when you're in high school, you're kind of a shithead. So ultimately, I didn't really kind of have too much of a spiritual kind of weaving with the author. But as time went on and I revisited it, I felt as though the trouble with the translations were that, like you say, it was archaic, and the, cultural undertones which the original translators were writing along were kind of out of step with our own experience of existence and reality, to say nothing, of course, of the not just the utility but the spiritual importance of these old texts, because they reflect an eternal principle regarding, the rise of civilization, the decay of civilization, in a kind of Spenglerian sense. And I suppose a lot of, what Tacitus was commenting on, and of course, a lot of, individuals who we disagree with would kind of trivialize the purpose or the conviction under which he was writing this kind of treatise. But I thought it was incredibly important because it talks about something that is very similar to the progression of Greece as a civilization. So, what I felt as though, when, for instance, Tacitus was talking about how the daily life of the Germanic individual, which is the males, would be, you know, brought up in a certain kind of environment where they were exposed to the cold, exposed to deprivation, had concepts of honor being, of course, the principle in their value system. And it's not that they're simple either. And I think he really kind of made it sure to explain to the reader that it was a choice. They were agent in their choices as far as what they chose, material accumulation values as opposed to honor-based values. And, talking about how women were faithful to their husband, and how women were actually part and parcel of Germanic greatness as one nation, in the sense that they motivated the warrior to actually go out and do things, and basically kept up their tent flaps, for instance, to make sure that their honor was beyond, basically impugnment. So I wanted to ask you, like, because I think a lot of our problems and the challenges we're facing today, everywhere in the world, especially in the West, is this kind of decomposition of values and our inability to access a world that is beyond base accumulation, base materialism. And I wanted to ask you, is there a central lesson or spirit that you're trying to, I guess, maybe port from the past, and part of the reason why you're motivated to translate and publish it or republish it, I guess, in this example? Is there
Yeah.
something of value for us modern warriors, so to speak, to learn from Germania?
Yeah. I mean, I think so. I mean, it's worth noting first of all that Germania wasn't just written as a kind of objective piece of anthropology or piece of history. I mean, it wasn't. The Roman conception of historical writing was as a moral exemplar. Why did you write historical? Why did you write about the past? Well, you wrote about the past to inspire people in the present to great deeds. That was the purpose of historical writing. Which is very different from the kind of modern professional historian who's writing in the kind of tradition of Leopold von Ranke, where you write to capture things as they really were. I think it's VS Eigentlich gewesen is the German translation of that, how things capture things as they were. So Tacitus was writing like Livy, like Caesar, to provide a moral exemplar. I mean, his conception of the precise nature of the moral exemplar was a little bit more complicated than someone like Livy's, for example, where Livy was just kind of documenting great deeds from Rome's past and just say, be like these people. The Tacitian conception of history informed by the present was slightly different because, like I say, he very much saw Rome as a society in decline, and he was warning against decline, and that runs through the entirety of the Germania. I mean, one of the central points of the Germania is that the Germans are the greatest threat to Rome. That's what Tacitus is saying. He says it again, and he says it explicitly at one point. But he's setting up a comparison. He's saying, look, we're this way. We do these things now, and the Germans do them in a completely different way. But that's actually the way that we did it as well. We were like that once upon a time, but we have decayed in our customs, and in our morals, you know, and it's going to be a big threat to us. You know, the Germans are vigorous, they're numerous, they have this kind of savage, simple virtue. And Rome is a decaying society, and Roman virtue has decayed, and so it's simultaneous. It's a warning and an exhortation, and I mean, obviously, the purpose for a modern reader, it's obviously not going to be the same, because Tacitus was addressing his contemporary Romans in 98 AD or whenever it was that he wrote the Germania. But there are all sorts. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting stuff to be gleaned from the Germania. I mean, one of the things that I say in the commentary at the beginning of the Germania is that actually, we've had generations of historians tell us that Tacitus was basically just making stuff up. I mean, that's that. Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's true generally for ancient historical writers, that modern scholarship, modern scholars tend to believe, for example, that Herodotus was just making up all this shit about the Scythians. Herodotus made up that they made their quivers out of human skin, and he made up that they smoked hemp, and he made up that the women also fought in battle. Well, guess what? Actually, archaeological discoveries have shown that all of that was true. Herodotus wasn't making that shit up; that was real. And it's the same. And it's the same with the Germania as well. And that's something that I sort of talk about in the commentary to the book. But the Germania has an interesting history because, of course, it's all implicated in the Third Reich, and it wasn't so much Hitler. It was Adolf. It wasn't Adolf Hitler, but it was Himmler who was obsessed with the Germania. He was so obsessed, in fact, that he actually launched like a special forces raid to go and collect one of the 2 or 3 surviving manuscripts of the Germania and take it back to Germany. I mean, so Himmler read the Germania as a young man, and he was very, very heavily inspired by the Germania with his vision of Germany's kind of glorious ancient past, and that there was basically that the historical German nation stretched back into pre-Roman time, or into Roman times, pre-Roman times even. Um, which Hitler actually wasn't so keen on. Hitler, I think, on at least one occasion, said to Himmler, "Look, I don't give a crap about these people living in mud huts. I care about the Greeks and the Romans, really." Like he wasn't so concerned about Tacitus at all. But for Himmler, certainly, it was a really a very, very important text, and it had been before Himmler, before the Third Reich. It had been an important text for German nationalism in the 19th century, for example, because they took it to say, well, the Germans have been a nation since Roman times. They've had this unique ethnic identity, they've had these unique customs, and actually they've been preserved into the modern day period. It just so happens that Germany isn't a unified nation yet, but we can be a unified nation again. So with the events of the 20th century, Second World War, etc., then the Germania became a kind of verboten book. I mean, it really did. I can't remember whether it was Mommsen or I think it was Mommsen. One very prominent 20th century historian, anyway, said that the Germania was the most dangerous. It was the most dangerous book of all time. He said that just because he thought that the idea of German nationalism was the most dangerous idea, and that because it was contained within the Germania, or one reading of the Germania, would suggest a kind of nationalistic vision of the German nation, then that made it the most dangerous book of all time, and
so. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt here, but I would even go so far as to say that Germania is a universal book in a way that Homer is a universal kind of text, in the sense that it ports a similar ethos. And when I had read Tacitus's treatise, I kind of it was part and parcel of how I became inspired to write a kind of, I guess it's purely a commentary slash kind of paraphrasing of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, because and guess who shows up in the Gallic Wars, right? It's the German mercenaries on both sides, and of course the
and also just the Germans themselves. I mean, with
oh yes,
Ariovistus, and that's a big thing in the Gallic Wars.
yes sir, absolutely, and that's exactly what I kind of, in my exposure to them, and it because it wasn't simply Tacitus, obviously juxtaposes Roman Empire times with Germania at their time, but also in Caesar we see that he was juxtaposing the decadence of the Gallic nations, or the Gallic nations, with the Germans, and because the Gauls had become decadent themselves, dedicated to wine and wealth, and while the hardy Germanic warriors were basically pushing their shit in, it was because of this moral tether. And it reminded me very much so of, for instance, the Dorian values, obviously archetypically shown or effused through Sparta and our conception of Sparta. But I guess what I kind of trying to get at here is kind of it. I think Germania is so potent and powerful because it does what Nietzsche talks about regarding historiography, right? He kind of talks about three types of historiography, which is monumentalist, critical, and antiquarian. And the utility, quote unquote utility, I think he would hate if I said that. The utility of monumentalist history is that it doesn't simply talk about the past, but it exalts one to action, to basically higher ideals, just as, for instance, Homer does, and many of the great texts of the world and world civilizations that actually inspire man to overcome himself, to become greater than simply who he's born to be. And so basically what it is, it's a text about the heroic, right? The heroic values of man overcoming himself, choosing pain, choosing the pain of discipline, choosing the pain of, whatever, adversity, to overcome themselves. And I think that's maybe why the text is so dynamic and eternally, how do you say, interesting to any generation. And what I enjoy about your translation is that for as much as Tacitus is very compressed and very kind of dense, it is also easily understood to be something very invigorating. And so I really appreciate the fact that you did it, because it's such a clear translation. It really does kind of give context to how exactly Tacitus was trying to connote the message, as opposed to these more archaic texts. So first of all, thank you so much, because it's absolutely a huge cultural movement here. So I appreciate that your work on it is really definitely an awesome addition to it.
Well, I wanted to sort of bring it into the distinction of the original Germanic spirit and sort of how it has evolved over time. Of course, we bring up the sort of evolution into more like German Prussianism. And a lot of times people will point out the distinction of the Nietzschean spirit to the German spirit of his time. And I think that Nietzsche really personifies an older German spirit. Of course, Tacitus writes of the individuality of the Germans and these Germanic tribes. And of course, you have guys like Junger call themselves the Anarch. And it sort of, to me, resembles this earlier German spirit that is distinct from the Prussianism of the future. So I want to read a quote actually from Germania, and then sort of we can maybe discuss this a little bit. And then on the Germans, Tacitus says, they have strong bodies, tight limbs, threatening faces, and a great vigor of spirit than the other German peoples. And he's talking specifically about the Chatti or Chat. As Germans go, they have great cleverness and ingenuity. They choose their leaders, obey them, know battle array, scatter their attacks, divide up the day, fortify by night, number fortune among doubtful things, and courage among certainties. And which is rarest, unless provided by Roman discipline, they set more store in the leader than in the army. So I wanted to sort of delve into this as a distinction between the Romans and the Germanics. And of course, it seems Tacitus here is almost, he's pointing to the this rugged spirit of the Germans. And even later on in the book, he he talks about the discontent between the Germans being the one thing that's keeping the Germans from threatening the Romans. So I sort of wanted to pick your brain on maybe this early Germanic spirit's distinction from Prussianism, and then how people like Nietzsche and Junger are almost like the original Germans in a sense of how they sort of personify the German, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's an interesting. When you said you were going to talk about that, then right at the beginning when you started talking, I did think, oh yeah, he's going to talk about the chatty, of course, because yes, I mean the chatty are the one Germanic tribe that Tacitus says are actually like the Romans. You know, they actually, in many respects, and they have the same military virtues that the Romans have, discipline and obedience, which otherwise actually, I mean, the ancient Germans, they're a heroic culture, right? They're a heroic culture, and much of what Tacitus is describing in particularly their military, their military was organized around basically like chieftains and heroes with their retinues, right? And he says, it's the best chiefs have the biggest retinues of the best men, and it's like it's all bound together by honor. It's all about personal courage and prowess, and like you have to defend your leader, and if your leader dies, you basically have to die too. It's all about strong personal bonds of loyalty. Whereas actually, what you've got with the Chatti and with the Romans, obviously, is a very different system where you're actually talking about basically like a professionalized military force with the kind of virtues and discipline and values that we would recognize in a professional military force today. Where it's like you obey the commander. Um, you maintain discipline and formation, and it's not necessarily about sort of like who is the most heroic, who's going to look the most heroic in the beer hall afterwards, or in the wherever. It's actually like you got to win, just got to win the battle by doing what you're supposed to do, and taking orders. So I mean, it's interesting, the kind of contrast between I suppose like heroic society and a more advanced, a more technologically advanced, a more differentiated society. You might call a more civilized society, even maybe perhaps, is very, very interesting. Yes, it runs through the Germania, and the Chatti are a bridge between the Germans and the Romans. But as a whole, yeah, Tacitus is saying, look, the majority of the Germans aren't actually like this, and they embody a very different kind of spirit and a very different kind of model of warfare. I mean, they basically live for warfare. That's what Tacitus is saying. He's saying like they he says something like how dull they would find it to till the soil rather than to earn with their own blood. Right, well, how much more they would rather earn with their own blood. What could otherwise be obtained with the sweat of their brow. It's stuff like that. Like these people don't want to till the fields. They have slaves, and and actually they make the women and the old men till the fields. And the young men have this strange kind of contradiction of character. He says where they kind of they'll lay around doing nothing, but all they really want to do is go to war. Like that's yeah, yeah, which is as Nietzsche says, that was the old Roman aristocratic way, was bellum et otium. It's war and leisure, but the leisure is devoted towards cultivating yourself for war, and that's it. It's like you're not a farmer, you're not tilling the fields. You're getting ready to go out and fight, and that's the highest value. Um, so I mean, yeah, I mean the Prussianism thing is interesting because obviously that is. I mean, people tend to think of like Prussianism as the German spirit, but actually it's not necessarily. It's certainly not if you look at the Germania, and to go back to what I was saying previously about ancient historians and modern historians thinking that they're just making stuff up. There's a huge amount of evidence, growing amount of evidence, that actually archaeological evidence in particular, that so much of what Tacitus described was actually true. I mean, the sticking point has always been that Tacitus probably didn't cross the Rhine. There's no evidence that Tacitus ever crossed the Rhine. He didn't actually go into Germania proper, Germania Magna. Like a modern day anthropologist, he didn't live among the Germans, but he encountered Germans in Rome. He would have seen slaves. He spoke to soldiers. And he also relied on the accounts of people like Julius Caesar who had actually fought against the Romans, right? And I'm sure that there would have been a whole load of eyewitness accounts and stories and all that kind of stuff. Would have been pretty current. I'm sure he would have had a lot of sources actually to draw upon. But anyway, so much of what he says in the Germania actually has been substantiated and is being substantiated by archaeologists. So they're finding. And I talk about this in the commentary at the beginning. They found these really, really interesting, basically massacre sites, sites where there were battles between Germanic tribes, and they did things like they mutilated the bodies and threw the bones and bodies into lakes, and they threw weapons into lakes, and I mean, like all sorts of stuff that Tacitus describes. Actually, like he talks about rituals with lakes, for example, and he talks about the way that, criminals are thrown into particular kinds of criminals are weighed down with hurdles and thrown into bogs, and homosexuals, particularly, I think he calls them polluters of the body, basically, which is a euphemism, but I think that's probably what he means. On the basis of this idea that anything that's shameful to society should be hidden. So it's like, you throw them in the bog so that it's like they never existed. They go away, they disappear. So I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that what's interesting about the Germania, especially in light of this new archaeological evidence and other evidence, and the evidence as well that someone like Herodotus wasn't lying, and you can't just assume Herodotus was lying, or that any classical historian or ancient historian was just lying. Even though there's a moral purpose, and this is another angle of attack. Because Tacitus had a moral purpose, because he wasn't doing what a modern historian did, because he wasn't writing objectively, just trying to catalogue facts, and that obviously somehow means that he's also that he's fabricating it. What's more important for him is to say the Germans aren't like the Romans, so they're just like a mirror image, or an opposite. But actually, you can write for a moral purpose and actually document reality, and this archaeological evidence is showing that. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, like I say, in the commentary, it demonstrates a very deep continuity in German history and character. It does, and that's obviously why it's been considered a very dangerous book. And
it's
yeah.
interesting to me that I call them communists as just like a rule of thumb, because obviously it's not a Marxist-Leninist thing, but we call them the Bugman, right? But the Bugman, it's curious that they always accuse what they're guilty of, and regarding especially history. So they talk about how one has to write objectively about history, otherwise it's not valid. But it's always curious because all their history is entirely built on a moral slant to substantiate their own moral convictions, which of course is designed to blot out any kind of sense of the heroic, any kind of sense that would be against the interests of what I guess would be their idyllic vision of Rousseauian man. And that ultimately, it's just like Pindar says, you can beat off nature with a stick, but it always comes back. And it's curious to me. I think part of the academic / cultural censure around Germania and around basically the classics in general, and of course modern writers who imbibe the same kind of ethos. The reason why there's so much censure is because what they were trying to do is blot out reality, blot out this other element of man. And to be frank with you, I always thought it was kind of funny, because at the end of the day, for as much as they may somehow, let's say, successfully burn the lighthouse of Alexandria, analog of today, that kind of spirit will always come back. That always that impulse in man to reach beyond himself, to dedicate himself to higher ideals, to have a different relationship with pain. For instance, I always talk about this, where most moderns are, or most bug men are just really kind of absolutely slaves to comfort, and it comes to them or their consciousness as like absurd that people will think of the good beyond feelings of pleasure or comfort or safety, and that there are people who will go out and do things and achieve great things at the risk of personal pain, suffering, whatever it may be. And so I think what I enjoy the most about Germania is that it's this unrepentant, unapologetic, maybe it's moral, but it's a higher morality. It's a higher kind of Spartiate type ethos that is trying to find itself back into the Roman Empire. And I think, to be frank with you, he was successful. And whether or not it was because the elites were actually reading his treatise or whatever it may be, I think the truth is that there is a sentiment, especially amongst maybe not the aristocratic Roman senatorial class, but certainly around the equites, to try and become this higher thing of Romans of yesteryear. And so you see this, for instance, in the classic Roman tradition of seeking out the enemy commander and stripping him of his armor after one-on-one combat, whatever it may be. And you see this as late as the Marcomannic Wars. And it's interesting that so much of modernity really loves Marcus Aurelius, but he was one of these figures that kind of try to suppress this heroic aspiration amongst the officer class of the Romans. And I see analogs today, especially exposure to the military, modern militaries of the West. Are myself a veteran, and you start to see the cultural decay find itself into the martial institutions of the West. And you see this obviously in the UK, you see this in Germany, especially after 1945, and you definitely see this in the United States. And ultimately, this is part of my project, of course, is to reach back and tell the truth, right? And the higher truth. And so I guess what I wanted to ask you is, because I know that your PhD thesis was more about the medieval era, and but I would feel like there, especially speaking about Prussia being, of course, the kind of inheritor of the what was it, the Teutonic Order, and then of course prior to that, there are obviously multiple different principalities and free cities and so on, but were there examples of this kind of Germania ethos in the medieval era, which could maybe we could trace as a continuity, and talk about? And I guess in the wider, I guess, Western sphere, so not simply in Germany, but in the Germanic West.
Well, so I mean, if you're going to talk about the influence of Germania, you have to talk about the survival of the manuscripts. And so by the end of the Roman Empire, there were very few manuscripts of Tacitus that survived, and that was probably, I mean, I think he fell out of favor after the Christianization of the Roman Empire. He became a much less popular author because he was pagan, among other things. And so by the end of the Roman Empire, there weren't very many surviving manuscripts, and it's only by chance, really, that the great works of Tacitus survive, or the fragments of them that we have. So I think the annals and the histories, for example, I mean, we don't have the whole works. They didn't survive, and only survived partially. But it was because of monks in the Carolingian Empire, so that's sort of modern day France, Germany, copying old classical texts, probably actually just as an exercise. So they were just copying Latin texts as an exercise. They were copying some of them to preserve them because they wanted to preserve them, but they were also copying them as an exercise. So you'd have like junior monks copying manuscripts. So it's only really appears to be a product of happenstance, really, of what's called the Carolingian Renaissance, which is seen as this sort of great flowering of learning again in the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne and his sons and successors. So, I mean, I think by the end of the Middle Ages, there was one manuscript of the Germania that survived that we know about in in the monastery of Fulda in Germany. So, uh, there's not really any evidence actually that anybody was kind of reading the Germania in the Middle Ages. So after the Middle Ages, when the manuscript was discovered and then it was copied and circulated, then yeah, I mean, after the Middle Ages, then people were thinking about ancient German history and were thinking about the kind of questions that you flag up. But actually, in the Middle Ages, it's not very clear that they were at all. There's not really any evidence of Tacitus having a great impact on thought or martial tradition or anything like that. I think he was, for all intents and purposes, just totally lost.
Wow. Wow. It's incredible because you think of, for instance, the early modern period, right? So basically the late Renaissance and after the 30 Years' War, the Wars of Reformation, etc., that there was this flowering of intellectual thought, which were a kind of exposure to pagan classical thinkers. And it's always curious to me because, you know, you read Machiavelli, for instance, and obviously is very much conversant with Livy and a number of other Roman authors. I always assumed, I suppose, that Germania would have been exposed at least even in the heartland of, you know, Latin culture. It's very curious that it was completely lost. That's incredible. And I mean, I guess it underscores the threat of basically losing these texts in the modern era, right? To allow them to blot out reality, which is very scary.
Yeah, well, it's not. Yeah, I mean, it's not really any different from the kind of haphazard oblivion that so many of these texts ended up suffering. I mean, it's oblivion all the same. But yeah, I mean, a lot of classical texts, huge numbers of classical texts were lost with the fall of the Roman Empire, and you know there are often references to works in other works. It will say like, you know, the volume by so and so about X Y Z, and then there isn't any surviving manuscript of that, so you kind of have an idea that that did at least exist once upon a time. Um, but yeah, I mean, when Tacitus was rediscovered during the Renaissance, he was really read as a kind of by people like Machiavelli. I mean, I think Machiavelli read Tacitus, and by other thinkers, political thinkers. You know, they were more interested in his political histories. They were more interested in the annals and the histories because they wanted to know about Roman government and Roman rulers and why they were good or bad rulers and how they ruled, and you know, because I mean the Prince by Machiavelli, you know, I mean that is a mirror for princes. That is a handbook for rule. And so people like Machiavelli were interested in Tacitus because they saw him as a very wise commentator on political affairs and on and on Roman history. So I mean, I don't. I mean, it's 10 years. It's 10 years since I translated the book and wrote the commentary, so I couldn't tell you in depth. But I mean, I mean, Tacitus was really the Germania was only really properly rediscovered, I think, in the kind of 18th and 19th centuries, and it really did contribute to the growing movement for kind of pan-Germanism, you know, for a German nation, for unification of the German peoples into a single nation. Um, uh, but it definitely, I mean, it did have a huge impact. It did have a huge impact. It was a very very important text. But yeah, I mean, I think probably for a period of about 1600 years or maybe 1400 years from, you know, like the fall of the Roman Empire until the 19th century, then it was probably actually a book of or a treatise of probably no influence whatsoever, which is interesting, you know, for it to be on the cusp of disappearing from history totally, from disappearing from existence, and then it just comes back in this huge way when you've got this political movement in Germany, or in the what would become Germany, for a German nation to exist, and it inspired all sorts of different people. I mean, there are lots of woodcuts, for example. There are these kind of like 17th, 18th, kind of 19th century prints of these kind of fanciful imaginings of the early German past based on Tacitus. Um, that are very, very interesting, with winged helmets and stuff, and all that kind of great big beards and axes and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, the history of the Germania itself is a fascinating topic alone. And there's a book about it actually that I talk about in the commentary. It's by Christopher Krebs. It's called A Most Dangerous Book, and it's about the history of the Germania and what happened to it.
Yes, well, I was going to go into, obviously Tacitus is trying to make a sort of moral valuation regarding the corruption and decline in Rome. But there's
Yeah.
also a very clearly he's also criticizing the Germans to some sense, because he talks about
Oh,
they
yeah.
can't unify, right? They're always at war. They lack this greater collective body to essentially wield the total power that they do have. So it's also a critique, and I think in this particular context, we can maybe have a discussion regarding the balance of this vital individualism that you see with the Germans, right? But also the necessity for order and sort of the political institutions for Imperium. And something I was thinking about was Evolution of Civilizations by Carroll Quigley. And of course, he notes these guttural, warlike peoples who end up sort of conquering the sedentary agricultural peoples. But throughout that, he also talks about how over time empires over institutionalize the forces that generally allow their expansion of power initially. So for the Romans, their constant warring, of course, ended up being to their detriment, because they became over reliant on a slave population to essentially drive their economy. And of course, I think Tacitus is looking at all this as to their decline. So I guess delving into this, what's the Aristotelian golden mean of taking this vitalism that we see with the Germans, but also the necessity for discipline and order and political institutions as an expansion of power, especially today, because there are no city states and tribes today. This great power game with countries like China necessitates larger political institutions that maybe are larger than we would like, but are almost necessary for our will to power.
Yeah, so no, I mean that's a good point about Tacitus's assessment of the Germans. I mean, yes, he isn't uncritical of them at all, and he actually says, these people have some major moral failings. I mean, he talks about the amount that they drink. For example, he talks about their crazy dice games. They gamble obsessively, and they gamble excessively. To the point where actually, when a German has lost everything he can gamble. He gambles his own freedom and goes into voluntary servitude if he loses. And he says something like, they call this perversity honor. He can't understand it. I mean, he's like, this is madness. But yeah, I mean, to kind of go back to what we were saying about the chatty, then the chatty obviously represents some kind of in between, some kind of, like you say, golden mean, perhaps, between the kind of heroic, individualistic virtues of the Germans, which get them so far and make them a very dangerous threat, but also incline them to warring against themselves, which is one of the things that Tacitus says. I pray. I pray to the gods that these people just continue warring among themselves, because if they don't, we're in trouble. But yeah, I mean, I think obviously, Tacitus. Tacitus's message isn't that Romans should become exactly like the Germans again. He doesn't think that the Romans should adopt all German customs. He doesn't think they should start drinking like the Germans. He just thinks that actually what they need to do, as you say, is they need to temper this softness, cut out the kind of corruption, cut out the kind of malaise and become more like they used to be. And yeah, I mean, I think it is obviously an interesting case study or an interesting analysis of the kind of relevant the relative merits of two very different systems, right? One is the heroic system, and the other is this, I mean, it's the Roman Empire. It had been an empire for the better part of a century. By the time Tacitus was writing, I mean, it was one of the great political powers in the world, enormous empire of many, many millions of people with tremendous power, probably actually in many respects, at the kind of apex of its power. But it had serious problems. And I mean, yeah, I think broadly the message of the Germania is obviously, in some sense, things start to go wrong when you forget who you are and what you are or what you were. And clearly, I think Tacitus believed that the Romans had forgotten who they were and what had made them great. I mean, he wasn't, although he was criticizing Rome, he wasn't saying that Rome wasn't great, and he wasn't saying that the Romans weren't great either. He wasn't saying that the Germans, in some sense, were better than the Romans.
So it sounds like it's a device to kind of, let's say, licit what was best and latent in the Romans of the time. And it wasn't necessarily to copy paste into their civilization. It's interesting because we talk about the heroic and the development of civilization, and obviously seeking that Aristotelian golden mean. And I'm reminded of this great book. It's Soldiers and Ghosts, and it's basically it's a historical treatise talking about the warrior ethos. But what's actually the most poignant to me is, and to me, I think the Macedonic kind of Pan-Hellenic Empire was probably the height of this perfect synthesis, because for as much as the I guess Alexandrian Macedonian phalangist army pattern was very much a soldiery, very much a kind of civilizational type schema. Alexander the Great and his officers, they were always trying to re-imbibe that heroic spirit. For instance, Alexander always slept with the Iliad under his pillow, kind of stories like that. And it seems to me like, especially the distinction between the enlisted and officer class, like, I think what it is that it's the heroic element that garners what is best or internally motivates, but it's also the synthesis with the real means of how to take technology and synthesize that with a heroic spirit. And I suppose going back to Rome during the time of Tacitus, I mean, we start to see obviously the professionalization of the Roman legions from the republican pattern to an imperial one under Augustus. And I'm always, we read about the Dacian Wars, for instance, and how usually the Romans would deploy their federati troops, their mercenary troops, ahead of the Roman legions, and the Roman legions had been relegated to a kind of either the main force / an engineering type force that was completely different from the early Republican levy type system. But it's just interesting. I guess I didn't really have a point to make of this, but it's, I guess, maybe a kind of tether to this idea of the synthesis between the heroic and real applications to real technological landscapes of our time.
Kind of building off of that, it's clear that Tacitus isn't necessarily trying to take an antiquarian position, like, okay, well, we have to go back to this heroic, almost Homeric people. He's not saying that, but he is trying to reassert a certain essence in a different form. So if we take the Roman Empire as even a further form of technology, for instance, right? Obviously, they're much more technologically advanced than the Germans, and that's an instrument of their power. I think what Tacitus is trying to do is revive this essence of heroism, but within a form that's more applicable as an expansion of power. So I guess what I wanted to ask was, today we're much more technologically advanced, obviously, and we have to embrace techne to win in the future. This is what the Chinese are doing. I mean, Spengler talks about in the End of Man and Technics that one of the great mistakes of the West was allowing these industrial secrets to be passed to the East. And he was talking about Japan, but now it's China. So techne is absolutely integral to will to power, and especially today. So I guess my question is how in this modern age do we revive an essence of honor and heroism without being caught in that sort of antiquarian uh, view of history, where obviously we have to adapt to the future, but we want to keep that heroic essence and reapply it to this modern era?
Yeah, that's a hell of a question. That's a hell of a question. I mean, I think it's quite a pressing question. And it's one of the questions, actually, the Bronze Age that kind of really animates Bronze Age mindset as well. I mean, there's that famous passage where he's talking about Mitt Romney, but imagine Mitt Romney, but he's like Carl McLaughlin's character from Dune, with a kind of special suit and a shield and stuff. And I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I suppose there's the possibility in the future, in the future of warfare, that actually what you'll see is you'll see new technology that allows a more kind of heroic, um, uh, kind of virtue to prevail on the battlefield. I mean, it's kind of it. It looks like it's actually going the opposite way, though, with things like drones, of course, and we've all seen the footage from Ukraine and the Ukraine-Russia war, where people are being pursued on motorbikes by drones and just absolutely murdered and massacred by drones before they even know what's going on. And we're going to have swarms of drones and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, on the military front, it could go multiple different ways. I mean, it could be that in some sense, technology enables a kind of more heroic form of warfare to come to the forefront, or it could be that actually technology makes basically individual agency on the battlefield. It eliminates it almost to an extent. I don't know, but I mean, more broadly within society, I don't know. I mean, it's a difficult question. I think it's obviously true that I mean, the many of the virtues that animated the ancient Germans were also virtues that have animated the greatness of the West in the past, and they need to be recaptured. I mean, it's not for nothing that a lot of the great kind of a lot of great thinkers in the late 19th, early 20th century, especially in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, kind of saw the roots of Anglo-Saxon values, of Anglo-Saxon liberty, of Anglo-Saxon success in the actual in Germania itself. In the ancient Germans under the kind of ancient oak of liberty. Where they elect their rulers or they elect their leaders in battle by their prowess rather than anything else. It's like an ancient democratic ideal. It's an ancient meritocracy in some form. It's like a proto kind of democratic system, and it's individualistic and rewards individual prowess and individual excellence and this kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think we probably do have to recapture some of that, but the question is how. And I mean, if I knew how, then I would probably occupy a more important political position than I do. But yeah, it's the question. It is the question. I think is how do can we return? And this is the question of the Germanian, I suppose, as well. It's like how do you return to the values of your ancestors? How do you return to the ways that made your people great in a situation where where technology, the material circumstances are so different? Like the the Roman Empire was so different from the early Roman Republic and also from from not even when Rome was a republic, when Rome was still a kingdom, when Rome was still ruled by kings. Um, uh, it couldn't. I mean, it couldn't have been more different. And so, yeah. I mean, I think that is probably the animating lesson for our time is that actually this isn't a problem. This isn't only a problem that we have faced. First of all, you know, I mean, it was a problem that Rome faced, and of course, we get these comparisons between the US as a late stage imperial decline. The comparisons with Rome are made a lot, and but people kind of mix the timeline up, because they talk about late stage imperial decline, but then they talk about Donald Trump as Caesar. Well, Caesar came before the empire, and it's all a bit confused. But nevertheless, I mean, I think that the comparisons and certainly the importance of the question, the probing kind of existential nature of the question is very clear from Tacitus, and he sensed it even at the end of the first century AD. Well, it took 300. It was 476 AD was the deposition of the last sitting Western Roman emperor. I mean, so it took a long time, but it did happen. So I mean, I don't think you can doubt the importance of the book or of the central kind of animating question.
And I guess to leave it off on a white pill to sort of summarize things, and maybe I'll see if you agree with this or not. But the idea of the sort of aristocratic warrior, or as Mishima puts it, the samurai being the total human being rather than a cog in the machine, I think that you'll see a resurgence of both the Renaissance man and the artist warrior, because with things like automation, technical skills are becoming increasingly unimportant. For example, you can get Grok to do the hard coding for you now. You can rely on automation for expertise. So I guess the white pill I'll leave with everyone, and then maybe see if you agree with this, is that because automation is going to fill in those cracks of cogs in the machine, this could enable humans to end up in a point where we do become that Renaissance man again. We do become that aristocrat because we have that leisure. I mean, you talked about it in the Germans, right? They have the leisure and then they have war. Well, in a sense, war can be seen as creation, as art, along with just martial war. So I guess the white pill, I think, is that with future technology, with automation, we're going to be less reliant on humans as cogs in the machine. So that's going to enable us to go back to that ability to create and sort of be total human beings. I don't know if you agree.
Well, you should read. I don't know if you've read this essay that I wrote called "Fully Automated Luxury Agonism."
I've
You
not.
read
I'll have
that?
to write that down.
Yeah, Fully Automated Luxury Agonism. It should be on the Man's World website under articles, and it's definitely on my Substack. And that is so it's a response to this really retarded book called Fully Automated Luxury Communism that was written by this guy called Aaron Bastani, who's a kind of like a Marxist guy in the UK. And his argument is basically about how Marx couldn't have foreseen automation, but automation is basically going to make a communist utopia inevitable because it's going to undermine all of the basis of capitalism and the basis of inequality, etc. And then we'll all just have like these wonderfully fully automated luxury lives, basically, where we can all be gay race communists. But my argument is that actually no, what actually automation might do is allow us the time then to be like the ancient Greeks. I mean, ancient Greece was a slave society, and so if you were a citizen, then you had slaves doing everything for you. That was the automation, and you just got to live an agonal lifestyle where you concentrated on self-cultivation, on competition, on excellence and striving and achievement. And so my argument is actually, well, imagine a world where actually automation allows people to do that instead. And, so you end up with like agonism on Mars, basically. But anyway, read the essay, because that is basically what I talk about. I mean, it's meant to be kind of provocative and a little bit silly, but it also actually I don't think it is that silly at all, actually.
Absolutely. Well, I'll have to read it, and if we're fortunate enough to have you on again, hopefully we can discuss that.
Yeah, we could. Yeah, we can talk about it. Yeah,
absolutely.
We can talk about it. Cool.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and everybody get Ren's copy of his translation of Germania. You can kind of see it. Mishima's in the way, but yeah, thank you so much for joining us and
my pleasure
discussing this. And As always, thank you, Legionaries, for watching. Thank you, General Lance, for joining. And this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the warrior philosophy. Ave Caesar. See you all next time.
Away.